what do you think is the biggest opportunity and the biggest risk for Nigeria today?
First, that was really thorough. I think the biggest opportunity is the timeline that it provides and an ability to actually supply the Dangote refinery the way that it's meant to have. I mean, the Dangote refinery had initially, NNPCL had initially, discussed with the Dangote refinery and reached an agreement for supply, but along the line they were unable to meet that supply. So this is an opportunity to actually dial that back. There's also an opportunity, given the timeline, 18 to 24 months is enough time
for Venezuela.
For Venezuela,
yeah. Even though I think that's going to be a tough ask, actually,
really,
because
it's quite...
the fields have been shut down for a while. We also heard about the immigration or exit of trained staff in the oil and gas sector. So do you think 18, 24 months Venezuelan crude will come back?
That's a very optimistic estimate.
Yeah.
I mean, more people have said 5 years.
Yes.
Like, that's enough time to actually get everything back in order, especially because at the moment there's still uncertainty, there's still volatility in the markets. People still feel like, people are still feeling a bit unsure. Also, it's very possible that the estimates of the extent to the damage done or the deplorable state of the wells may have been underestimated, and then upon actually, I had read something about how a report on how the wells are actually uninvestable.
These are the Venezuelan wells.
Yeah, the Venezuelan wells. But then again, so I guess there's enough time for the Nigerian government to actually re-strategize and decide how it wants to respond to this. I mean, they still have to respond within the confines of the OPEC quotas and limits and things like that. So now is the time to actually decide where to who to sell their oils to and how to actually sell it.
Okay.
So I think there's enough time. The risks, they're very obvious. If Venezuela comes back online, they can produce cheaper. Nigeria might just have much more oil than it needs on its hands, and then this is also an opportunity for the Nigerian government to actually maybe focus on refining its own oil, restarting or expanding capacity of existing refineries and getting them back online to actually produce. It's not impossible, right? So I guess these are the...
Okay, so it's interesting because one of the other dynamics there, which we've seen many market analysts talk about, is the fact that Nigeria can actually refocus again on Asian markets. Because in terms of transportation of oil, Venezuela to China or India compared to Nigeria to China and India, from a transport and logistics shipping perspective, Nigeria does have a strategic geographic advantage. But when you look at some of the issues that we see in some of those demand centers, China with growth slowing down, reducing its demand, and then OPEC also holding back spare capacity because the IEA is telling us we're oversupplied in this market. Do you think that strategic advantage will really play out for Nigeria?
Yeah, so, China's current situation, the slowing is not permanent, right? It's not like China is dialing back or switching to more renewable sources of energy for their production, right? If that was the case, like you're seeing in Europe, it would have been more dire for Nigeria. So the opportunity still exists, with China still... the hope is that China restarts its economy or production improves, their property market gets back up, and just several economic... everyone is hoping that China gets back on its feet. The way they were pre-COVID, it seems like since COVID, it's just been tumbling and it's just been pretty slow, much slower than anticipated. But, if nothing actually happens, like you said, there are other Asian markets that could provide, I guess, a market for the Nigerian crude, and they might push those in that direction. But yeah, I guess these opportunities still exist. It just depends on how, I guess, aggressive Nigeria can be. Usually, I think Nigeria tends to take a wait and see and a follow through kind of... Nigeria is more reactionary than proactive policy, really. So hopefully this is not the case for this.
Okay, so let's talk about oil prices a bit. Now, I don't know what your take on it is, but this year we've seen what happened to Brent, to WTI. In fact, usually when you typically have a major geopolitical crisis, prices tend to go up $80, $90 risk, and especially because Venezuela is a member of OPEC. So if there's a political intervention in that country from a major superpower, we expect markets to pricing premiums into the oil price. And we didn't see that. Oil prices actually fell on the back of a major geopolitical crisis, which I guess kind of further validates the idea that our market is oversupplied.
Yeah.
So what is your outlook for the oil price in 2026?
I think, so another thing is, apart from the market being oversupplied, Venezuela, while it has huge potential, wasn't doing so much in the markets. I mean, 1% in the general oil production, global oil production, was pretty much nothing, especially in a market that's oversupplied. I think it would remain, up until they start producing, it would remain
marginal.
We'll see a marginal within $60 range. Might even decline even further in the near term.
Primarily due to an oversupplied market.
Exactly,
yes.
Especially when they now start to produce more. I think what we're starting to see is the extent to which renewable energy has actually, penetrated the markets. Like you said, things like Europe's energy was a big part of, I guess, was a good gauge of how much demand for renewable energy, or even oil. Like once people start switching to renewable energy for cars, for heating and things like that, then, they don't really need your crude as much. So it's going to be very interesting in the next few years, next year especially, to see how demand would increase. I think that things will still remain marginal up until we see significant production, especially because while I think it's too soon to actually tell how much of the production in Venezuela would actually make an impact, because people are still speculating how deplorable the state of the oil wells are and how quickly they can start producing. There's also the issue of, or the potential change in power in Venezuela. While the vice president has been sworn in, there's a part of the constitution that says that for 30 days after the president vacates office, there should be an election after 30 days. So and it seems like the Venezuelans actually want an election. They want to be able to decide who their president and who their government should be. So if that also happens, that might also affect, how quickly American companies can start or restart production in Venezuela.
Yeah, that's interesting, because Venezuela, at one point was doing over 3 million barrels. Now they're doing 800,000 barrels a day. And part of that is due to sort of mismanagement and some of the other political issues they've had in the country. But coming back to Europe obviously was a major center of demand. And Europe is one of those where we've seen the impact of renewables, like you said, sort of shifting demand away. But the other interesting thing, we've had countries like Brazil ramping up oil production. We've had in Guyana, a country that produced zero how many years ago, is now doing 600,000 barrels a day. And I think in my mind, what this signals countries like Nigeria, who've been established long-term producers, is that our 1.3 1.5 is a huge underperformance. I personally think even 2 million barrels a day is a huge underperformance, given that at full capacity we could be doing 3 million barrels a day if we maintain current levels of investment. So I guess the question is, there are new sources of supply that will continue to come on global oil markets. So we should be repositioning. And so just on a final word, in terms of helping to boost domestic production in Nigeria, what do you think our focus should be for 2025?
I think
2026, I beg your pardon.
I think increased investment in the sector. In the last 5 years or the last decade, we've seen a lot of sort of exits from the markets.
Exits onshore to offshore, to focus on onshore.
And then we have seen a shift in the composition of the investors in the markets. We're seeing more domestic investors sort of play much larger role. I mean, more recently, we saw Tony Elumelu invest in Seplat, and so we're seeing more domestic. Again, that also mirrors what's happening in the stock exchange markets with domestic investors, taking a huge bet on the Nigerian economy, investing locally. So I think when there's increased investment, it also signals OPEC that Nigeria is actually able to increase its quota, because there was a time when Nigeria wasn't even meeting its OPEC quotas, like because of how low production was and how the issues with security and all of that. So when we see increased investments, it signals to OPEC that, Nigeria can take on more production. Maybe we'll see our quotas increase. Maybe we would then start to produce more. But certainly, I think that we need more investments in the space. We need the government to also be quite aggressive and proactive in going out to look for more markets.
Yeah, so a quick word. Our budget assumptions for oil prices this year, $64 a barrel. We're currently at 60 at the start of 2026. How likely, is there a major fiscal risk there, or do you think Nigeria will weather the storm?
I think Nigeria is always super optimistic with the budget assumptions. It's been a while since budget assumptions for exchange rates, for crude oil prices were actually, over or underestimated. We're usually super optimistic. The government is usually very optimistic. I think eventually, we're still surviving regardless of our optimism, regardless of, always overestimating. I think the government will still survive. We would see with the new tax laws, we expect that non-oil revenue should also increase. So when we see that increase, that should make up for some of the shortfall in the oil side. But I don't think that oil prices or revenue from oil would hit the mark for them this year.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, still cautiously optimistic note, even though Nigeria does face headwinds from global oil dynamics. Thank you so much for joining us, Gbemi Alonge.
Thanks
Great to chat with you on this topic. Well, that's all we have time for on Business Week. I'm Rolake Akinkugbe-Falani. Let's continue the conversation on these and many more topics on X. Do have a lovely rest of the weekend.